Jost has done a lot of that work. Jost's supervisor is Mazarin Banaji, and Mazarin Banaji is a known Marxist. And so this is another place where political ideology contaminates, as far as I'm concerned, scientific inquiry, because Jost's work on let's say resistance to change is predicated on the idea that the conservative inclination to support the maintenance of already existing structures is precisely equivalent to supporting an unjust system. And that's not a reasonable thing to do if you're looking at these sorts of things from a scientific perspective. You don't get to make judgments like that, but they're built into the questionnaires. So, resistance to change reflects the extent to which people wish to maintain the status quo, while tolerance of inequality reflects the acceptance of an unequal distribution of resources and opportunities within society. These two dimensions appear roughly aligned with social and economic conservatism as expressed in the constructs of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, respectively. There is no left-wing authoritarian psychological scales. We're trying to derive one right now, but the reason for that is that after World War II, the social science community was responding to what had happened in Nazi Germany, and perfectly appropriately, and they examined right-wing authoritarianism as a consequence, but they never examined left-wing authoritarianism because the prevailing, what would you call it, political landscape of the time made the idea that there could be left-wing authoritarianism sufficiently incorrect politically so that it was never analyzed from the perspective of social science, even though the evidence for left-wing authoritarianism, say by the end of the 1940s, was absolutely overwhelming, right? By the 1930s, people were reporting on what had happened in the Soviet Union, you know, the forced dekulakization, for example, of the agricultural industry in the Soviet Union and the consequent deaths of several million people in the Ukraine. It was all extraordinarily well documented. These core facets of conservatism are also closely related to the two higher order value dimensions described in moral foundations theory, which reflect preferences for order and tradition on the one hand and preferences for egalitarianism on the other. Importantly, the motivational basis of these two dimensions appears to vary independently from one another, with an individual's overall political attitudes on a left-right spectrum emerging from their relative balance. These motives are also strongly rooted in basic personality characteristics such that preferences for order and tradition are associated with higher levels of orderliness. Now you might think that's obvious, right? Well, obviously orderliness is associated with preference for order. That's not the issue. The issue is whether or not you can measure it, right? That's the issue. So these things seem self-evident, but it's taken a very long time to build up the instruments that allow them to be measured in such a way that you can also start to look at the correlates and the underlying psychophysiology. So it's by no means obvious. Higher levels of orderliness, an aspect of conscientiousness, and politeness, an aspect of agreeableness, as well as lower levels of openness and intellect. In contrast, preferences for egalitarianism are uniquely associated with compassion, an aspect of agreeableness. So, and that's exactly what we found when we were looking at political correctness, which is primarily predicted not by openness or by conscientiousness, but by agreeableness. Political conservatism can therefore be thought of as a social immune system, reflecting the extension of pathogen avoidance mechanisms to the integrity of the social system. Borders, boundaries, right? That's the orderly person. We'll keep borders between concepts. We'll keep borders between people. We'll keep borders between towns. We'll keep borders between political ideas and religions and states. Why? Because we don't want the terrible things flooding in from everywhere. Now, the liberal will say, wait a minute, all the things flooding in from everywhere aren't terrible. They have great utility. And that's true. But the problem is, they're both true. They're both true at the same time because, well, and we'll document that as we move forward. So then the question is, well, how do you know when things should be more open and when things should be more closed? And the answer to that is, well, you better have a chat with everyone and find out what they think, because it's a balance of probabilities. There's no way of determining it a priori. It's a balance of probabilities. And so you have to have a discussion to determine how wide the gates should be open and how narrow they should be closed. And that's also going to depend on the circumstances and the situation. So there's no way of, this is the thing that's so terrible about this. There's no way of determining a priori whose position is correct. Just as the behavioral, yes, in particular the social immune system would help to maintain order by suppressing any actions or individuals that deviate from a group's accepted social traditions. It has been reported, for example, that regions with higher levels of disease prevalence tend to be associated with higher levels of social conformity and autocratic rule. Individuals who feel more vulnerable to disease likewise report higher levels of ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Such basic concerns about pathogen avoidance may thus contribute to the desire for order and tradition among conservatives, along with the harsh moral judgments associated with violations of the social order. How do you purify something? How about with fire? That's something to keep in mind as we move towards the more political expressions of this. And the thing about something that's disgusting is you don't isolate it exactly. You destroy it, right? It's the thing you do with rats and insects, for example, is destroy them, right? And you do that with poison, you do it with fire, you do it by cleaning things up. And you do that because, well, the rats will eat all your crops and the insects carry disease and all of that. So, or they infest your food, which, you know, I don't know what proportion of today's food production is eaten by rats and insects, but it's a huge proportion still. According to the Parasite stress hypothesis, authoritarian governments are more likely to emerge in regions characterized by a high prevalence of disease-causing pathogens. Now, who the hell would have ever guessed that? Hey, this is where you see the real utility of a genuine social science, because it's by no means self-evident, this hypothesis. And this paper that I'm going to discuss with you right now just blew me away when I read it. I thought it should have been front page news across the world, but it didn't really attract that much attention. Recent cross-national evidence is consistent with this hypothesis, but there are inferential limitations associated with that evidence. We report 2 studies that address some of the limitations and provide further tests of the hypothesis. Study 1 revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. So that's very interesting. So the more parasitic and transmissible diseases in a particular locale, the higher the probability that people, when measured at the individual level, held authoritarian attitudes. Because you might say, well, there's parasite prevalence, that produces a repressive government, but it doesn't really affect people at the level of personality. And that's not what was found in the studies. It was reversed. The parasite prevalence / infectious diseases made people more authoritarian, and that was what was driving the more authoritarian government. So here's something cool. Who knows about this, right? So how do you fight authoritarian governments across the world? You get rid of infectious disease. That could be it. That could be the key. So, and then again, that is by no means a self-evident hypothesis. Study 1 that revealed that parasite prevalence strongly predicted cross-national differences on measures assessing individuals' authoritarian personalities. And this effect statistically mediated the relationship between parasite prevalence and authoritarian governance. Parasites, personality, authoritarian state. That's the causal pathway. This mediation result is inconsistent with alternative explanations for previous findings. To address further limitations associated with cross-national comparisons, Study 2 tested the parasite stress hypothesis on a sample of traditional small-scale societies. Results revealed that parasite prevalence predicted measures of authoritarian governance and did so even when statistically controlling for other threats to human welfare. One additional threat, famine, also uniquely predicted authoritarianism. Together, these results further substantiate the parasite stress hypothesis of authoritarianism and suggest that societal differences in authoritarian governance result in part from cultural differences in individuals' authoritarian personalities. Here's the effect sizes. So look, they're mind-boggling. So first, that's authoritarian governance. 1, pathogen prevalence. The correlation is 0.42. 0.42, right? There's malnutrition. There's warfare. It's actually negatively correlated with warfare. Famine, 0.26. So if you square that, that's about 8% of the variance. That's about 16% of the variance. So those are walloping effect sizes, right? That effect size is about, so that's 16%. The typical effect size for a personality variable is about 0.2 to 0.3. So let's say 0.25. So that's about 7% of the variance. That's 16 to 17% of the variance. You almost never see a correlation of that size. So it's an absolutely remarkable piece of work. And it has all sorts of terrifying implications. So the question is now, why would you have such a powerful immune system, behavioral immune system, disgust system? Okay, so let's look at some little known facts about the history of North America. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but it's worth knowing. Okay, so what was the pre-Columbian population of the Americas? The answer is we don't really have any idea. The estimates vary from 10 million to 100 million, with an emerging consensus of 50 million. Well, it's halfway. Okay, we don't know. We could be out by one order of magnitude, but a fair number of people. So what happened to all the Native Americans? Well, that's easy. They all died. Why? Because when the Spaniards came, see, there was no diseases in the New World, except for maybe syphilis. There's some evidence that syphilis was transmitted back to Europe as a consequence of contact with North and South America. But there were almost no diseases in the Americas. And that's partly because there were no big cities, and also because even where there were, not compared to Europe, and also because where there were big cities in Europe, people lived close with animals, and there was lots of movement of disease pathogens back and forth between the animals and the human beings. And so lots of Europeans died as a consequence of that, like huge numbers of them, especially from diseases, say like smallpox or measles. But the Europeans built up a whopping immunity to all these diseases, including influenza, and then they came to the Americas with their diseases, and bang, it killed all the Native Americans. It figured 90% of them. So here's some of the statistics. What were the diseases that wiped them out? Influenza, bubonic plague, smallpox, measles, even chickenpox was deadly to the Native Americans. So from 1492 to 1650, there was a death toll of 90%. So, you know, when the Puritans landed in the US at Plymouth Rock, that was a long time after the Spaniards had landed in the more southern areas. The Indians, the Native Americans there, they were desperate to see them because they didn't have enough people to take off their crops. They didn't have enough people left. You imagine 9 out of 10 people died. That's everyone, right? You're done at that point. And so there were 25 to 30 million people in Mexico before the arrival of Cortez. 50 years later, there were 3 million. So, and the Aboriginal population in Canada, estimates, this is accepted by the Canadian government, no one really knows, and the estimates do vary substantially. There might have been 500,000 people in Canada in 1450, and that decreased by 80% after contact with the Europeans. There's the population collapse in Mexico. 16th century population collapse in Mexico. So the 1545 and 1576 epidemics appear to have been hemorrhagic fevers caused by an indigenous viral agent and aggravated by unusual climatic conditions. The Mexican population did not recover to pre-Hispanic levels until the 20th century. Absolutely catastrophic consequences. So then you look at that and you think, well, is it really all that surprising that people have evolved extraordinarily powerful immune systems, disgust responses, and behavioral immune systems? I mean, this is no joke. It's absolutely catastrophic. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about Hitler. So when I was sorting some of this stuff out, trying to look at this disgust sensitivity literature, and then understanding finally that it was associated with orderliness, and that orderliness was associated with conservatism, I was also reading a book by Adolf Hitler, which was called Hitler's Table Talk. It's a very interesting book, and Hitler had secretaries at his dinner tables from 1939 to 1942, and they basically took shorthand notes of what he said spontaneously. And so there's a book that you can buy called Hitler's Table Talk that is nothing but a presentation of his spontaneous utterances across that time period. Now, Hitler was a very strange person. He was very high in openness, surprisingly enough, but also extremely high in orderliness. At least that's what you can infer from reading the historical data. So he bathed 4 times a day, for example. He was also a great admirer of willpower, which is something that's also associated with conscientiousness and orderliness. So he was very proud of his ability to stand like this for 8 hours in the back of a car, and his ability to withstand, you know, what would you call them, trying circumstances by willpower alone. One of the most famous film documentaries that was made in the Nazi era was called Triumph of the Will, right? Triumph of Willpower. That was by Leni Riefenstahl. I'm not saying that quite right. You can look at that on YouTube. It's a very interesting film. Horrifying film, but a very interesting one. Well, if you're wondering about orderliness, I mean, take a look at that, man. So that's Nuremberg, right? That was the biggest rally grounds ever made in human history, Nuremberg. And Hitler was unbelievably good at spectacle. Look at how absolutely perfectly ordered that is. God only knows how many people there. Several 100,000, because they could all fit on the parade ground at the same time. All in absolutely perfect formation. Orderliness, gone out of control. It's interesting because people think about Nazism as a descent into barbarity, right? But what it looks like is a disease of civilization. That's a whole different thing, because conscientiousness predicts predicts success in complex industrial societies. And this is actually conscientiousness gone out of control on the orderly end of things. And why? Well, the 20s, the World War I, that was plenty chaotic. And there was a huge famine after World War I, right? In Spanish influenza, killed more people than the war did. And it actually mutated in the trenches, because if people are packed close together, then viruses or other pathogens can be very deadly, because you don't have to live very long to give it to her. If people are dispersed, then the virus or the bacteria can't afford to kill you as fast, because then it dies too. And so if you pack people together, then you can breed unbelievably virulent forms of pathogens, infectious pathogens, and that's what happened in World War I. Packed all the men together in unsanitary conditions, poof, up came Spanish influenza, went all around the world after World War I and killed more people than the war. So, and after the war, after World War I, of course, Germany descended into utter chaos. And so what happens when you descend into chaos? And the answer is there's a corresponding call for order. And that was answered by Hitler and the National Socialists. And Hitler was very good at listening to the German population, and what they were demanding in a period of chaos was order. And so that was exactly what he decided to provide. Spectacles of order, which is exactly what you'd expect from someone who is really high in openness and high in orderliness, right? Spectacles of order. And Hitler was also extremely interested in art, but he categorized art into like proper hygienic art and improper chaotic art, and he often would have art exhibits at the same time of the approved art that he approved of. So those were in the official museums, let's say, and then there would be a corresponding exhibit of degenerate art. And that was art that was associated with movements like Expressionism, for example, which has garish colors and it's very emotionally expressive. Hitler sort of preferred kind of eroticized Greco-Roman representations of heroic people. You know, that was the Nazi aesthetic, essentially. So there's some more examples of order, right? Look at that. Everything geometric, everything regular, the borders completely well defined. Everything here is squares, everyone's lined up perfectly, everything is uniform, right? Look at, there's pathways between the rows of people. This is again at Nuremberg. Perfect order. Along with his plans for the world capital Germania, Albert Speer, that was the Nazi architect, made the plans for the world's largest stadium, which was to be located on the Nuremberg rally grounds. Derived from the Panathenaic Stadium of Athens, it would have offered 400,000 seats. It was to get the shape of a horseshoe. Planned dimensions, 800 meters wide, 450 meters high, 100 meters, with a building area of 350,000 square meters. The laying of the foundation stone was on 9th of July, 1937. It was to be finished for the Party Congress of 1945. In 38, the construction began with the excavation. It was stopped in 39, but during the whole war, the casting pit had to be kept dry from entering groundwater. After the war, the northern half of the pit filled up with water and is today called Silver Lake. The southern half was used to deposit the debris of the destroyed downtown Nuremberg. That's Nuremberg at night. So what Hitler did, because he was very good at using fire and light as display as well, so that curtain there, so you see there's the Nuremberg buildings that we saw in the last photograph. Those are the searchlights from the Nazi Air Force. So they had them arrayed all the way around the grounds there and pointed straight up, so that the nighttime rallies were illuminated by a cube of light. Very effective display, artistic display of orderliness. Now, here's where things get seriously ugly. So this is a pamphlet from, I think, 1944. And the pamphlet is called Jew as World Parasite. So this is something I found on the net. I'll share it with you. Very rare original late 1944 anti-Jewish Third Reich pamphlet. This very scarce 6 by 8 3/4, 20-page softcover booklet by M.L. Reifer and Erich Schwartzberg was published 1944 in Frankfurt. It was published at a time when a great percentage of the European Jews had already been deported to concentration camps in the East, perhaps to justify what had happened to the Jews since the Nazi seizure of power. The authors compare the Jews with parasites, the most unpleasant forms of life on earth, and that it is only natural and justified against them to free humanity of them for the sake and survival of mankind. This is from the pamphlet. The people of the world will recognize the Jew as world parasite, and there will be a time when there will be one united front of all people against the Jewish world parasite. The pamphlet ends, and humanity will be freed from the most severe illness from which it suffered from thousands of years. Here's what happened in Nazi Germany. So when Hitler came to power, he was very interested in public health campaigns. And so he formulated a number of policies, including formulating these vans that went around screening people for tuberculosis. At the same time, he announced a policy to beautify and purify Germany. And so he encouraged the factory owners to clean up the factories, to get rid of the rats and the insects, and to plant flowers and so forth in front, right? So it was cleanliness and beauty. They used Zyklon B as the agent for disinfecting the factories. Zyklon B was the gas that was used in the gas chambers. So Hitler started out by getting rid of the rats and the parasites and the insects in Germany, along with his public health campaign. And then he moved into the insane asylums and started a euthanasia campaign. And then he moved outside into the broader political sphere and started to target the people that he didn't consider pure as parasites, capitalizing on the behavioral immune system and people's intrinsic sense of disgust. And so I'm going to show you some of the propaganda that did that, so that you know how this sort of thing works. Okay, so this is from Richard Koenigsberg, who wrote a book called Hitler's Ideology: Embodied Metaphor, Fantasy, and History. So we've already sort of discussed the idea. This is sort of an archetypal idea, grounded in biology, you know, that you're run in some sense on this underlying biological platform of deeply rooted hypothalamic systems and amygdalic systems and so forth, and that you're a collection of those underlying systems organized at some higher order level. Well, those underlying systems manifest themselves in fantasy. So for example, if you're hungry, you're going to get a fantasy about going to get something to eat. And if you're lonely, you're going to get a fantasy about someone that you'd like to be with, and so forth, because the fantasy is part of the manner in which these underlying biological motivation systems think. Okay, so what do you think? How do you think and talk if you're possessed by disgust? Okay. The state did, these are from Hitler's utterances. The state did not possess the power to master the disease. The menacing decay of the Reich was manifest. The masses feel that the mere fact of the Jews' existence is as bad as the plague. Politicians tinkering around on the German national body saw at most the forms of our general disease, but blindly ignored the virus. At the time of the unification, the inner decay was already in full swing, and the general situation was deteriorating from year to year. The nation did not grow inwardly healthier, but obviously languished more and more. It's all disease metaphor. It's all disease metaphor. The symptoms of decay of the pre-war period can be reduced to racial causes. Anyone who wants to cure this era, which is inwardly sick and rotten, must first of all summon up the courage to make clear the causes of the disease. They think that they must demonstrate that they are ready for appeasement so as to stay the deadly cancerous ulcer through a policy of moderation. The Jew must take care that the plague does not die. If this battle should not come, Germany would decay and at best would sink to ruin like a rotting corpse. You can see in the Reich today an example of mortal decay. That is not the speech of someone who's possessed by anxiety. That's the speech of someone who's possessed by disgust. They're not the same thing. The 1st of May can only be the liberation of the nation's spirit from the infection of internationalism, the restoration to health of peoples. Against the infection of materialism, against the Jewish pestilence, we must hold aloft a flaming ideal, another purification metaphor. The restoration to health of our people must start from the restoration to health of the body politic. So that was Hitler's essential metaphor. The nation was a body. Right? It was a pure body. It was a pure Aryan body. And it was being assaulted by parasites that were subjecting it to disease and decay.